Thank you all so much for coming. I'm really, really excited to get to be a part of this conversation and to have so many talented women here to have the conversation with. So thank you all for being here. I want to introduce our panelists. Mary Jo Pitzel is a reporter for the Arizona Republic. She covers the Arizona legislature, state policy, and politics, and she also runs the Best of the West journalism contest. Let's see, next we have Retha Hill. She's the executive director of the Digital Innovation and Entrepreneurship Lab, and that's at the Cronkite School at ASU. And prior to that, she was vice president for content for BET Interactive. Thank you so much, Retha, for being here. Next, we have Amanda June. She is the owner of Smokefire Media and the editor of the new publication, The Visionary Business Magazine, which is a national publication based in Arizona that is dedicated to cross-cultural business relations and economic development in Indian country and in Latino communities. And also we have with us Paula Bovin. She is a sports columnist for the Arizona Republic, and in 2010 she was named one of the nation's top 10 sports columnists by the Associated Press sports editors. And all of these women have many, many more accomplishments that I could spend a lot of time lauding, so I just want you to know that they are really some of the best journalists we have in Arizona, and I'm really, really excited that they're all here with us, so thank you all. I think today we're going to have kind of a sort of an informal structure for the conversation. I'm going to let all of the panelists know you should feel free to jump in and interject and comment or raise a question whenever it comes up. We will take questions from the audience at the end of the conversation, but we'll make sure to leave time for them. So I think we'll just get started. So when it came time to start thinking about what we were going to talk about in this conversation, there were like lots and lots and lots of things that came to mind, and I did a little bit of thinking on my own and kind of crowdsourcing from other women that I'm friends with who are journalists in many different places. And there were like lots of things that came up, and it was a little bit hard to narrow everything down for this conversation. So I tried to sort of think about the things that come up in my career, and I think come up in your careers, and we can just sort of start there. But like I said, if there are things folks want to ask at the end, you should feel free. So we know that journalism has been historically a very white, male-dominated profession. And that is something that is beginning to change in some newsrooms, but there's still the problem of something called gendered expectations. So by that I mean that sometimes men are given certain responsibilities and assignments and women are given others. And like a lot of times, I don't even think it comes from a conscious place by the manager who's making the assignments, but in the back of someone's mind, there's this sort of subconscious association where maybe like, you know, they immediately think of a man who's a reporter to do, say, a hard news story or to go cover a war. And maybe when it comes to human interest stories or things that require a little more sensitivity, maybe a woman reporter comes to mind, just as one, for instance, one example. I kind of wanted to start really broad and just think about maybe what are ways that we can begin to kind of address these sorts of problems. So I want to just sort of open it up and see if any of you have encountered those kind of gendered expectations and how you'd like to see them tackled.
For years, and this is a real tough thing for me to deal with because I found like I suddenly became the women's sports expert because I was female. I would be assigned to cover women's basketball or you know, a women's tennis match, when I didn't have any special knowledge of women's sports other than I was female, but for some reason they felt like that was necessary, and it was a struggle for me early on because the reality is, and it's still today, that women's sports tend not to be very well read in our paper. It's getting better, but the public wanted to read about the Cardinals and the Suns and the Diamondbacks, and so it was kind of a struggle for me to, you know, I wanted to be the stuff that was read, but I also felt it was important to get women's sports in the paper, and I guess kind of the way I reconciled it was, I made it an effort to find good story. I think you can find a good story anywhere, whether it's on the Cardinals or whether it's a girls' high school basketball team. I just felt it was sort of my responsibility to work a little harder to find those stories, and then they could be well read. But I think it's important, and I think at least sports editors are getting more sensitive now and realizing just because a female's on the staff, you shouldn't, be sending that person to cover only women's sports. It's taken a while for them to get there. And the reality, at least with me, of changing that mentality was having very frank discussions with my sports editors about it, because as you pointed out, I don't necessarily think it was mean-spirited or intended in a bad way. It just was sort of this natural reaction. So that was kind of my experience with sports.
I think I'll just kind of add on to what Paul was saying too, because in my world, and kind of unbeknownst to me, I guess, because I've just always worked in usually in nonprofits and doing marketing and media relations with nonprofits. When I jumped into the business realm and then doing journalism in the business realm, it became very apparent to me right from the beginning that this was an extremely male-dominated world. And our magazine focuses on Native American and Latino business particularly, but even in those two realms, in Indian country and in Latino business, it's still very much male-dominated. So there's a lot of kind of like you have to pick your angle, I guess, of which you go in, because women are seen either as one way or another, kind of either being the pleasant kind of party fun-going woman to be around, that may or may not really mean business. They're just kind of the party favor, or they're the kind of the mean, I guess, meaner spirited, quote unquote, kind of bitchy women that they don't want to have around because they don't know what you're going to do in media or not. And so it's kind of hard because you have a fine line to go in between that, to try and not be pigeonholed into one of those categories. So I found it's kind of like you have to really dig in deep and really know what you're about in those areas, because it's easy to get played against one or the other, to have people kind of have those perceptions about you, and just being persistent is a really key really really key part that you can't get discouraged, because they tend to shut you out for that reason, just because they for one reason or another might not take you serious. But that was a key insight that I found right away, being persistent.
Well, speaking from my experience at the Republic, currently I work at our state capitol bureau, and it's a 3-person bureau, and it's all female. And our politics team is 5 people, and it's 4 women and 1 man. So we've sort of churned the corner, maybe too far. There's a lot of estrogen out in the office. And I'm not quite sure how that affects our coverage. I think we're a more collegial bunch, just maybe because we're women or because we're in a small little office. But where I encountered it more was the first time I was doing pretty intense politics. I covered a gubernatorial campaign, and then the first term of Governor Symington, who was probably governor when you guys were in grade school. But he would often sort of look at me and just say, you just don't understand, Mary Jo, especially when he was a candidate. He had a real estate empire that was literally crumbling as the campaign went on, and properties were foreclosing, and I'd find out about it, and you'd have to ask him about it. It's very embarrassing, because he built his whole reputation on his business record, and said, I'll run the state like a business. Well, his businesses were all going downhill. But he would often just say, you just don't get it. And my colleagues in the press corps at the time would say, well, God, he's really talking down to you. It's probably because you're a woman. And I sort of fought against that. I said, no, I think it's because I work for the big dog. I work for the Republic, and we have, a story on the front page of the Republic, especially back then, carries a lot of impact. At least I would like to have thought that he was not talking down to me. He was certainly always very polite, very gentlemanly, but it was interesting to encounter that more from sources than from my editors, who seemed to sort of grasp early on, and this might be because the people that put me in these positions were female. They sort of grasped early on that, yeah, of course you can do this job. I mean, you just got to go out there and you've got to be persistent. Persistence is a very important thing.
The only thing I would add, I mean, I've been out of the newsroom now for a few years, but back in the day at the Washington Post, when I was a reporter there, I think a lot of those battles had been fought previous to, me getting there, but there were the residual effect. We had a lot of women reporters and editors, but they had to sue. They had to do a lot to get that respect and get the foot in the door to get some of those plum assignments. But even with that, I think some of the foreign correspondent positions and some of the national political positions were still heavily dominated by men, covering Congress, covering the White House, and certainly overseas. And the thing with overseas, the overseas assignments, is that's where you got at the Washington Post, you had to punch your ticket overseas, particularly in the European or the British bureau, to be considered for a national editing spot. I mean, there's no way you're going to ever become a managing editor or executive editor of the Washington Post without having been overseas and in the European or the UK bureau. It just wasn't going to happen. And so you did see that. And then a place like the Washington Post and the New York Times is very, very competitive too. So I think, there was probably a time where some women kind of washed out of that, just didn't want to spend, 20 hours a day at the office and constantly, throwing elbows to get ahead. I mean, it was everything you've ever read about the Washington Post. It's true. Very competitive, and I don't know how much that's changed over the last few years, but you had to be prepared to fight, and I mean with that definition, to fight for any plum assignments.
So I want to sort of follow up on that, and something that I think everyone else touched on at some point in their answer, which is the idea that part of what we need to do, particularly because we may come in already sort of having these expectations of us that we're trying to work against, that I sort of wonder what you feel like we can do to assert ourselves, but then at the same time we all have this understanding that being assertive is in some ways a double-edged sword. In some ways it's like a very necessary thing that you have to do in order to further your career and in order to advance. But if you become too assertive, then you sort of run this risk of people thinking of you as too domineering or as like having too much of a presence that they see as threatening. So I'm sort of wondering how you begin that process of working against these sorts of expectations.
Well, I think, just from what I saw back then and in other newsrooms or media companies that I've been in, it's having strong allies, other female managers who can help you to, be the best that you can be. And you have to be assertive. You have to stand up for your positions. You have to be a leader and really know what you're talking about to be an expert in whatever it is. Having moved over from the newsroom to the early days of the internet, even before .com came about at the Washington Post, there weren't that many people who knew, anything about it. So it was easy for me to go back to the newsroom and tell them, what they needed to do and how it was going to be. But I just think you really need to know your area and be as strong and as opinionated as you need to be to get them to pay attention to you.
Being assertive doesn't mean that you have to be bitchy. You can smile, you can be friendly, but keep going back to persistent, as Amanda said. I had a source once. We were on a plane, spend the whole day flying around Arizona, and this was a gubernatorial aide, and he looked at me towards the end of the day and he said, "You're such a nice person. How can you write all those terrible things about us?" Anyway, it's like, well, because it's the truth. But the point is that you can still do your job and do some stuff that people aren't going to be happy with, but they'll still talk to you. It's a lot is in how you present yourself, and there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with smiling. There's nothing wrong, with keeping a civil tone and recognizing that you're gonna ruffle feathers, and you're going to come back and you're going to do that again, but you're going to have this kind of conversation. So I would just keep that in mind. Assertive doesn't necessarily always mean being overly aggressive to the point that you turn people off.
Right, but you can still get that and look at the whole thing that's happening this week with, Megan and Fox. It's just incredible. I mean, there was nothing inappropriate or, outlandish of the way she phrased her question, but, she's just getting this, attacked by the candidate as well as other people who are attacking her personally. And, she said it in the most professional way possible. And it's just amazing that this in 2000 and what year is this, 15, that we're still, women are still being attacked like that for asking, I thought it was a good question.
Yeah, and she even dared to, when Trump interrupted with the little Rosie O'Donnell crack, she came back and just said it was more than that. That my goodness, a follow-up point, from a moderator, that was totally appropriate and unfortunately rather rare.
Yeah.
I think, and you guys kind of alluded to this too, if you know what if you're fair, if you're honest, and if you're accurate, that other stuff really doesn't come into play. I think you're judged more if you make mistakes in those situations. If you're assertive but you're making mistakes, then you're just kind of blowhard, But if you're assertive and you're right and your facts are right, especially in journalism, I think that goes a long way to sort of people judging you sort of differently. So it took me honestly years in this business. Assertiveness is not my strong point, and so once I sort of learned those kind of rules and following them, it made it easier for me to be that way. I could sleep at night. I was assertive, and maybe people were mad at me, but what they saw in the paper was right. That was a lot easier to deal with than being assertive and opinionated in the paper and then maybe having a fact wrong. So
I completely agree. With everything that they're saying, that because I'm not a very aggressive person, and I definitely don't look or sound that way to anybody that's ever met me. So it's very hard to try and pretend that I am, to be something that I'm not. And so I've had to really, kind of put the two together and say, okay, well, do I really am I okay with showing this side of me? Because I feel like people see you as weak. But I really had to, because I'm very relatively new in the media world. I mean, less than 5 years altogether, I think. So compared to these ladies, it's like, and then I threshed myself out there willingly and just kind of put that out there too, because it was something I felt needed to be done. But I really had to, struggle with those types of issues, is that you're very afraid at first. It's a lot to deal with in your own self-image, because you're wondering, how are people perceiving me now? How does this change the way that people look at me? Now you remember the media, everyone's going to be, criticizing or scrutinizing. So I really had to look into more of myself and becoming more comfortable as well. And I looked to a lot of my other either mentors or people that I idolize in media. It's like Ariana Huffington. Like I'm reading one of her books right now because it's really helping me on becoming fearless, because that's exactly what you have to do in media. I'm finding out is that you have to really become fearless in so many different ways in your own self-image, to be comfortable and kind of strong enough to do the job sometimes, especially in areas that are male-dominated or have very little women presence. So I think there's a lot of that, having to become fearless and more comfortable with your own self to be able to deal with those struggles.
And I want to talk more about that idea that we have to sort of become comfortable with ourselves in order to be fearless, and in order to project the image of ourselves that we want other people to see. Obviously, you're all here because you're incredibly talented and accomplished women working in the field. But one thing that I think has come up for me and has come up for a lot of my colleagues is something called imposter syndrome, which is the idea that you feel less knowledgeable than you actually are about something. So, for example, women are more likely, when you call them and say, we need somebody to talk about, whatever the thing is, women are much more likely to be the ones that say, oh, you know, I think you should talk to my colleague. He really knows a lot about that, even if maybe she's the one that authored or co-authored the paper or has been doing research on the subject for a long time. So it's this idea that you're like worried that people are gonna like discover that you're like some kind of fake, that, you know, you're purporting to have credentials that you don't have. You're not really an expert on the NFL. You're not really an expert on whatever the thing is that you cover. So I kind of wanted to ask, you know, is this something that any of you have experienced, or have you noticed colleagues that experienced it, and how do you deal with it?
Gosh, that's certainly in the sports realm.
Yeah.
It's huge, and I'll tell you something that just happened this week that's feeding this imposter thing for women in general. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of the NFL teams, came out with this initiative the other day. I think they called it Red, and their way of getting women interested in the NFL was to, I mean, gosh, this was right out of the 50s. It wasn't about, you know, here's some information about football. It was like, we want to get more women interested in the Buccaneers, so here are some ideas so you could bake snacks for your husband's party. And while you're making these snacks, you can learn a little bit about what a play clock means. And instead of just saying, this is the NFL, I looked this story up, it is unbelievable. They're catching so much grief, it's so funny. But it's like, it's already saying, women, you can't understand, you know, what a field goal is, or what a play action pass is. Men can understand that, but clearly women can't. So I guess my point is, it's still so alive, feeding just you and me and all that, and it's crazy. But yeah, I've sort of dealt with that for many years, and you know what Mary Jo was saying about how the governors just sort of assumed maybe she didn't know things. I would get that all the time. I'd be in a circle with other reporters talking to a coach, and he would be explaining, he'd say blah, 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 and then he'd look at me and say, Paula, when I say that, that means, you know, sort of separated. I know. So I dealt with that for years, and I think as women, I mean, it's obviously things are improving, and not only in sports, but in society, but yeah, it is. You feel a little bit like you're an imposter, and only through years of being in this business a long time and sort of earning the respect have I felt it change. And it's funny because my voicemails at the Republic, they used to be, you're an idiot and a woman who knows nothing about sports, and now it's, you're an idiot. I'm like, yes, now I'm just an idiot, you know? I mean, it's come around, and I think that only through time has that changed for me. So that was my long-winded story.
One thing, too, that, you know, when you're first starting out, you have to admit what you don't know and be upfront with that. And I think, you know, and then just be, you know, a student of whatever it is that you're covering or you're doing, whether it's technology or photography or producing or covering a beat. You just have to, you know, get into it and learn as much about this subject as possible. And then just, you know what you know. You know it, and you wouldn't be in the position unless they had confidence in you. Or maybe you had to fight for the position, but whatever, you're there now, and you might as well just, you know, just push back and just keep on going and just win that respect and not worry a lot about what other people might think of you. And I know that's hard, especially for women, but as an, you know, as an African American woman too, you know, I think about all the comments that are made about us, you know, or about black women, and you just have to let it roll off. And you know, think about your end goal. And if your end goal is to be the best, you know, sports writer, if your end goal is to put, you know, to help your family and provide for your family, whatever it is, or to launch a business, that's what you have to keep your eyes on, that prize, and not let what other people have to say about you deter you from it, because they're going to talk anyway. I mean, you look at Serena Williams. I mean, that's just like my perfect example of this woman who's like amazing, the most amazing athlete probably that's out there right now, and you know, all the names that she's called and all the comparisons, and she's just winning, you know, majors and just going for it. I'm sure it hurts on some level, but you can't stop and worry about what people are going to say about you, because they're going to say that anyway.
I'm sort of tempted to say, fake it till you make it, except I do believe you've got to be authentic and you've got to be truthful. But I remember, again, it seems like all I've got are war stories, but sitting in a meeting with an editor and a fellow colleague who was male, and the editor said, "Oh yeah, well, how many visitors does the Grand Canyon get in a year?" And he says, 3 million. And I'm like, I don't know. Well, he didn't know. He just pulled that out of some nether part, and because I went back later and the Google, I did a quick search and he was wrong on his, but he sounded like he knew it. So there's something to be said, like, I don't know, but I can certainly know where to find out, or I can certainly find that out quickly. I mean, especially as a journalist, that's our job, is to find things out. It's not necessarily to know everything off the top of your head. But, so I, exude confidence, but maybe, don't fake it if you really don't know what you're talking about. But, and the guy with the 3 million, Grand Canyon visitation number, well, he's not a journalist anymore. I am.
I wanted to sort of ask too, is there, when you're sort of trying, especially when you're at maybe the beginning of your career, and there are a lot of things that you don't know, is there a way to sort of work to build that kind of confidence that you can at least hold your ground for the conversation and then kind of go figure out what it is that you need to do, or you can sort of, be in, particularly when you're in a room full of men who are working on the same project as you, and you're feeling like maybe you're not quite the same part of the conversation, or you're worried that like you're gonna say something foolish. Is there a way to sort of work on building that kind of initial confidence so that you can then take the next step and learn the things that you need to know and kind of begin to move forward?
Well, I mean, I think it's what Mary Jo said. You talk about what you know, and if it's only a bit of that conversation that you're really confident about, then you either you speak on that and then you ask questions, and and then the follow-up conversation, a little bit more. I mean, I think that's the main thing, and probably also talking to other women who can be mentors to you in a newsroom. Whether it's an editor or senior producer, or someone who owns a business, or who's a tech and who has a lot of respect in the tech field. You just have to talk to those people and just practice. Practice what you need to say. I remember when Mrs. Graham took over, Katharine Graham took over the Washington Post after her husband committed suicide. She had to practice greeting people, who would come to her house, because she was so painfully shy. And she would get in the mirror and practice saying, "Hi, how are you? My name is." That's what she had to do. And look at her. She turned out to be, the most famous and influential publisher in the history of American journalism. And she had to do that. So do what you have to do.
I think preparation too. I mean, talking about being in a meeting, feeling uncomfortable, or doing a story and feeling uncomfortable. Any way you can prevent that by you maybe working twice as hard beforehand and prepare. Certainly within the sports journalism community, women have always felt like you've got to maybe work twice as hard because your mistakes look twice as bad if you're female. You'll get attacked twice as hard. So I always sort of found the solution to that was to try to go into situations maybe triple prepared then compared to what other people were doing, and helping avoid those situations. I know, and sometimes you can't, but that was how we kind of approached it.
One thing that's come up a couple of times is this idea that we should really look to other women in the newsroom as mentors or as allies. Does that become especially difficult when you work in a particularly competitive place, as you described, Retha?
It can be, but a place like the Washington Post or ABC News or CBS, BET, these are big operations, and so you can always find, a person to mentor you, and it doesn't have to be a woman. And, it can be. I've had female mentors, I've had male mentors, people who, not only show you where the door of opportunity is, but give you the key so you can get through it. And you you just have to find that person that you click with and who can help you navigate those sometimes treacherous waters. And then when you reach whatever position that you reach, you have to be a mentor to others. You have to reach back even to people who are a few years behind you. Remember getting to the Washington Post and that first week or so, Gwen Ifill and Michelle Martin and a couple of other women, took me out to dinner and just told me the pitfalls and where to watch out there. And I'm forever grateful to them. And they were just a few years older than me. And of course, I did the same thing, a few years later when other people, came along.
And I think to your earlier question about, how to like be ready, and the point of preparation is great. And, no matter what, and also practice, if you're going into an interview or a meeting, what's wrong with maybe finding somebody in your workplace who's a mentor and just walking through, say, can you take a few minutes and help me prepare for this? Let me toss out some questions and do a little bit of brainstorming. I do that. I mean, I work with very qualified people in my tiny little bureau, but I'm more seasoned than they are. And one of them always is asking questions, and I'm flattered that she asks for input. And I think it's helped to make her journalism better. And, so we do a little practice in the newsroom. And actually, that's a good lesson for me to learn and feedback. It wouldn't hurt me to practice either before I go out and do some things, instead of just marching into them cold. But preparation and practice can boost that confidence.
I think one key thing I would add that just kind of I found that has really helped me on my side, especially getting started in a new business and a new enterprise in media, was really taking the time to build a strong network of peers and mentors, and I wouldn't ever shy away from looking out for male mentors as well, because a lot of the mentors that I had first were all male mentors in the media field, and they were great. But it was really a key factor for me to have a network that I felt supported me and that I could go to ask questions if I didn't know something, or that I could just kind of observe and watch and learn from, that knew what they were talking about, so that I never had to feel like I have no idea what I'm doing, because there was this great group of people that I always knew I could go back to and say, hey, I have a question. It might sound stupid to you guys, but I really need to know because I don't know. And they were always there for me, and they're still there for me. So I think that's really, and then when you do make any kind of big leap into doing something for yourself or a bigger next step, they're the first ones there too to say, how can I help? I know of this other opportunity. Do you know so and so? Here I'll connect you with this or that. So that was always a huge part of that. So I think definitely being prepared is a huge thing. Trying to research and find out what you can, what you don't know, and having that network are really big pieces of it.
Yeah, and Amanda raised a really good point, is having that network. And if you're not a member of some sort of organization, whether it's Women in Media or whatever it is. I just returned from the National Association of Black Journalists conference in Minneapolis, and besides going to Paisley Park and hanging out with Prince, which we did, it was fantastic. Only for 2 minutes. He only showed for 2 minutes. But the point is that you heard the story over and over again of people saying, they were the young reporter in Ferguson, and they were covering it, the local reporter, and as soon as the story got really big, they were snatched off, and it was given up to a more senior person. But the young lady who since moved on, she said she was warned by one of her mentors through NABJ that you stay on that story until they take you off. And so when the blow came, it still hurt, but she was prepared for it. And of course, those same people saw and helped her get to the next thing, to move on to the next thing. And so whether you're a member of the Native American Journalists Association, or Hispanic Journalists, or NABJ, or a women's group, it really helps, because you get in those positions where you really don't know. When I was vice president of starting BET.com, I had to put together a budget, and I had no idea how much it cost for Associated Press content. the Post always had it. Just came, it was like air. It was always there. So, you call up, one of the operations assistant metro editors, and I asked, how much does it cost, for the Associated Press? And they told me. And so I could figure it out from there. And people are willing to, answer those questions. You don't have to pretend, that you know it. You just call up your network, to use Amanda's phrase, and you get those answers.
And to follow up on that, an example of how those organizations are so important, there's a female sports writer years ago named Lisa Olson, who actually grew up here, went to, I think, Shadow Mountain High School, got a job at the Boston Globe, very accomplished. And then when she was covering the New England Patriots, went into the Patriots locker room after a game and was harassed, sexually harassed like I've never heard. I mean, it was horrific. And that was bad enough, but the aftermath of the lack of support from the team, to people breaking into her house, the fans, it became a big story, so the fans were blaming Lisa, not the Patriots. And it got so bad she quit her job and moved to Australia worked in media there for probably 8 years. And she's now back. She was working for in New York until recently. And she said the only thing that really helped her get through was this organization called the Association for Women in Sports Media. And during that time, other female sports writers were really the ones that understood what she was going through, and they were the ones that are calling her and writing her letters and helped support her even when she was in Australia, because there just weren't that many other people that were doing it, and that helped her survive this horrible ordeal that has gone down as one of the most horrific cases of sexual harassment in sports journalism. So I think the point is great about organizations and the value of them, and how someday they may come and support you in some way.
So particularly in fields or when you're covering a beat where the gender disparity is really great, such as in sports, or I do music journalism, I find that there's a pretty big disparity there. I think we see it in tech, we see it in business. There are a lot of fields that are still, even if the general assignment reporters in the newsroom are a better balance, those particular beats still tend to be pretty heavily male dominated. And I wonder what advice you would give to a young journalist who is interested in pursuing one of those fields, who wants to be a sports reporter, who wants to be a music journalist, when they hear this kind of a story and become really intimidated, and it's really daunting. Like, how do you say, yeah, I'm a young woman and I really want to write about sports, and I feel like I am not welcome there?
Yeah, that was, and it's still a problem, not to the degree that it was in the past. I think a lot of women got out of the sports journalism business because it was such a bad deal. And fortunately now, most professional teams, and certainly college teams, are having classes where they educate their players. There are going to be women coming in the locker room. This is what you need to be prepared for. They didn't do that. But I still see women very intimidated. And the big thing is, certainly in sports journalism, it is to maintain the professionalism of, and it shouldn't matter, but it does, of how you dress and the questions you asked, and be prepared. And don't ever give anyone, even if it would be unfair, a reason to challenge you or question your motives or things like that. I mean, there's, when the Super Bowl comes to town, they have even when it was just here, a big media day where media comes from all over the country, in fact, all over the world. And the one media day, there's always a woman from, she's from Mexico, I think, with a station there, and she dresses up in a wedding dress and like she was proposing to Tom Brady. While we were all asking serious questions, she was like, "Tom, will you marry me?" I was cringing, because those are the things where the professionalism becomes an issue. And so that's always been my advice to sort of young journalism students is the professionalism and how you carry yourself, the thing about preparation we keep talking about. Those are kind of the things that matter. And then what we were also addressing, of finding a core supporters, of allies, of men or women in your field who can be there to support you and answer those kind of questions and things like that.
Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I guess I would just say, in my own experience, because a lot of that was very new to me as well. Going into the areas that I decided to go into in business, and doing interviews with these, with either tribal council members or chambers of commerce and things like that. People that I maybe had never associated with before I decided to get into media, and it just really it really showed me how much I didn't know about my own, I guess my own insecurities, in as much as how I would approach someone in that situation, and you don't find out until you're until you're actually in it that you're like, wow, this is really uncomfortable. This is really not what I thought it was going to be. So I think, and what I found though was that, and that's just goes back to my, because I'm kind of firmly on that idea now, that you really have to bolster up and cultivate your own fearlessness, because it's what I found is that a lot of times, men, just because of their own aggressive natures, or it's just how they are, it's kind of that they're intimidated, or they are threatened. They are they look at you as like, even if they're not intending to be that way, when you come into a room or into a situation, they're still thinking in their heads, like, it's like you can read it on their face, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And it might not be as negative as you perceive it to be, what they're really thinking, but it does come off. You do get that vibe when you enter a room or when you get into a situation. And so what I found is that it's really more of an intimidation factor, and it's just kind of their reaction as to like, what's she doing here? What does she want? So they're really just testing you, at least in my experience, as to how serious are you about being here? How serious do you take yourself? Because they're gonna see if you're not. They can read it. They can smell your fear. It's almost what it feels like. So it's really more of an intimidation. So you really have to convince yourself how serious you are about what you're doing, and why you're there, because that's kind of the only thing you have to fall back on when you get into that kind of a situation. And so I really think cultivating that fearlessness and reminding yourself constantly, this is why I'm doing this. This is why it's important. This is why I'm here. It does make a difference that I'm here, and I am here for a purpose. So, because it's very intimidating, can be.
Absolutely. We've been talking about this idea of professionalism and what that means, particularly for women. And Paula raised the issue that in certain cases that also means how you dress and how you're presenting yourself. And it seems like those kinds of issues, particularly as they're related to appearance, and even related to sound in broadcast. I mean, we hear it a lot in radio, we see it a lot in TV, that there are so many instances where women are judged for things that are not their reporting or their ability to produce or to turn out a story. I mean, obviously some of the issues Paula raised come to mind. You think about when you see women on TV presenting news, either as anchors or as reporters. You think about what typically women sports reporters look like on TV compared to the men who are standing next to them. And you also think about, I mean, as a radio journalist, I think a lot about the conversations we've had in the last couple of years about women's voices and about vocal fry and about what it means if you sound too high and what it means if you sound too low. And I think about the fact that some of my colleagues from when I worked at NPR, who had been in the industry for a few more decades than I have, had been taught to lower their voice when they got on air so that they would sound more like a man, so that they would sound more authoritative. And that how for women now in their 20s and 30s, that's totally backfiring. So I kind of want to get everyone's take on this, but I'd like to start with Retha because of your experience working in TV. And I know you work for BET.com, but for having worked for a television network, just if you have any sense maybe about how we can begin to shift the conversation away from those things or to make those things less of an issue for women.
Well, just to clarify, again, I was always on the .com side, but, it's surprising to me that in 2015, we're still dealing with this. But, what I see as a news consumer is that, especially a local news here in Phoenix, I don't know what the dress code is on local news news here. It's just amazing. I mean, compared to Washington,
That's true.
you know, I would say the Condoleezza Rice look, you know, of the helmet hair and the beige suit, and then you come here and it's like the women look like they're going to the club. Um, and I don't know why they, you know, why they feel a need to do that, as opposed to focusing in on the journalism and what they have to say. Um, there was a incident recently, a few months ago, where a guy, a reporter, anchor, said he wore the same suit every day for a year and nobody noticed. But you know, he did it to make a point. I think there is still a lot of emphasis on appearance. I think, as you know, as Black women, particularly, to wear your hair natural on television is, you know, a death sentence. You just can't get a job. Our young reporters at the Cronkite School are always asking. They ask me, but I've never, you know, I'm not on air, so it doesn't matter if I always wear my hair natural. But they can't do it, and I think there's a lot of probably pressure on young white women to go blonde, as opposed to having, you know, to continually lighten their hair. And you know, in the years I've been in Phoenix, I've noticed, you know, certain reporters get blonder and blonder.
It's
and
the sun.
yeah, right. Yeah, the sun in a box.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just bizarre that we're still talking about this. And I think that, you know, consumers of news just need to speak up about this. Who cares what you look like, what you're wearing, but are you a really good reporter?
Well, although I think your point about the dress code, like for TV, is a good one. My goal as a journalist is I don't want to draw attention to myself. It's what I'm writing about or whom I'm interviewing. So you try to dress appropriately for the situation. You try not to, you know, go to the club if you want to make a big statement, you know, a personal statement. But because you are, as Paula said, you are judged rightly or wrongly by, you know, how you're dressed and how you sound. I do occasionally the journalist roundtable on the Channel 8 on Horizon. And that's an older demographic, mostly, who watches that show. And one year, I opened my mail. It was a handwritten note from Virginia in Sun City, and she said, you know, I really like the show, and I really like what you say, but could you please do something about your hair? You know, your hair is just very distracting. And I was like, oh my God, oh my God. It made me incredibly paranoid. And later that year, I was at the gym working out, and this guy walks up to me and goes, oh yeah, I saw you on TV last night. You look like you partied really hard. And it was just, I mean, it's discouraging, but it's made me more attentive to my appearance. I'm not invited on Channel 8 for how I look, but it distracts. I don't want that to distract from the message, so I'm a little more attentive now. And on the Fridays, I pack extra makeup, and I bring hairspray with me, and I need 10 minutes before the show starts to make myself look not like an anchor, but to look like I didn't just get dragged out of the alley, because which is how I feel at the end of the week, at the end of a Friday. So I guess my point is that you should be cognizant of how you dress, and if you're gonna wear the super short skirts or the show cleavage, you better be ready for some feedback on that, and willing to take it. I opt to not go there. I don't want to distract, and I think those kinds of things are distracting. And now my hair, I'm trying to not let that be distracting.
Your hair looks great.
Thanks.
To follow up on just you're talking about people being blonde on TV locally, and I noticed like about 2 years ago everybody became sleeveless too, which was something we didn't see. But a friend of mine told me, he works at one of the local stations here, which I won't mention, but when they all went to HD, suddenly the women started showing up at work with larger chests. I mean, they were all going to get implants because they felt like this is HD, you know, people are going to look at them and they're being judged. It's really, I feel really bad for women who work in TV, because while there's been improvements, women are not allowed to age. I mean, you see anchors, male anchors, much older than female anchors. Certainly in the sports TV realm, I mean, you know, you rarely see a woman over 35. You know, Chris Berman, he was on ESPN, he's a great anchor, but he's not going to win any awards for his looks. It doesn't matter to anybody, and it's just in this day and age, it's so frustrating to me because I think we don't give the public enough credit. I think the person doesn't have to be beautiful on TV or in the mind of what we stereotypically consider beautiful. to be respected by the public, and I think that's just so obnoxious. And the only way I see it changing, and it is a little bit, at least maybe in sports, is the media itself is sort of calling out the media. We're seeing, radio, TV columnists and newspapers picking up on this issue a little bit more. Erin Andrews, who's a sports journalist, there's a lot of talk about her, and that made headlines. And there's been questions about our people, these women that are on the sidelines, educated enough in sports and to be there. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. And that's really the only way I've seen it changing, is when these people are called out, and just, but it's still, I think the TV business can be really awful sometimes, broadcasting.
One of the things that I also think came up, and it came up a lot when I was thinking about preparing for this conversation, and I was talking to other friends of mine who work in different media outlets, was the idea that when you're a woman or a person of color, or you belong to some kind of underrepresented group, that sometimes you can feel this certain kind of pressure to be like bringing the voice of that group to the table when you're at an editorial meeting. Or maybe you don't feel that pressure, but other people put it on you. Maybe someone will say, "Oh, Sarah, what do you think? What do you think about whatever?" And it's very, very clear that like you're the only woman at the table, and you're being asked this question because somebody wants like a woman's perspective. So I wonder, if any of you have felt that kind of pressure, and how you cope with it, how you make it known that yeah, you are a woman, but you're not all women. And also to make sure, you're bringing these kind of questions to the table, but not being seen as someone who like only raises these questions. I think this is like a complicated one.
I was going to say I can definitely relate to that, because I'm pretty sure it happens on a weekly basis. 'Cause not only am I usually, one of few women in certain cases, but definitely usually the only Native American woman in a lot of places. So, I mean, you just assume that you're going to be the only one of a certain, ethnicity kind of. So it's kind of something I already assume it's going to be like that. But so I guess it's just kind of embedded in me by now to just be like, yes, I'm going to be asked these things, certain things about what's, this is in Indian country, this is about tribes, to that, or we look to the person to represent that. And I just, whether it's wrong or it's right, I don't really pay attention to that. I just kind of try and make sure that I'm a good representative of who I am, and kind of what my beliefs are, so that, I'm more educating rather than leading on stereotypes or bringing out stereotypes that people want to play on. So usually that's kind of my role, I find, when things like that happen, is more debunking stereotypes and things like that. And so just speaking to what I know is more factual, rather than playing on what people want to think or believe about a certain ethnicity, or just because I'm a woman.
I mean, we talk about this all the time at NABJ and other circles, that they want to make you the black spurt, about everything African American, and sometimes you resent it, and sometimes you feel like you have to speak up, because if you don't bring that perspective to the table, why are you there? Because you do have a unique history, and if you're in an editorial meeting or you're talking about things, you do have to bring that perspective, because you can't assume that other people know it. But yeah, it's annoying, to have to do it, especially when people are not getting educated about a subject. Or when you see the Sunday talk shows, that when they bring out, brown or black people, it's usually when, it's an issue. When, Trump makes comments about immigrants, then all of a sudden you have someone from Univision, on Meet the Press, or if there's an issue with, race relations, and all of a sudden they bring in Gwen Ifill or somebody like that. And it's completely annoying, but what can you do? You just pray for change, that at some point, and keep calling people out, and just NABJ, NAHJ, the Hispanic journalists, the Native Americans, and the Asian American journalists, we continue to call people out when they do that, when the only time you have a black, brown, or Native or Asian person on is to talk about a particular ethnic issue as opposed to just talking about the economy or the Iran nuclear deal or, you know, the trade deal or whatever it is, because we do cover those issues as well.
Is there, do you ever run into a problem where you think that maybe there are some issues that you want to raise, or there are, you know, there's a story that someone in the newsroom is doing and you see like a very obvious angle or a very obvious question that you have that's related to race or gender or class that you want to bring up, but you get concerned that like, if I keep raising these issues, if I keep saying, but how does that affect women? Or is there a disparity of women that maybe you will be seen as like this sort of oversensitive or like too much of a feminist for the newsroom? Like, how do you sort of deal with balancing the fact that you want to raise these issues, that if nobody else is going to speak up about this, you have to be the one that speaks up about it so that the media coverage changes, so that people think about it? Because we're in the media and we're in a position of power in the media, how do you do that and then at the same time have your colleagues not see you as like, oh, well, Sarah's always going to bring up the feminist thing?
Well, you can, you know, pick and choose your battles, of course, you know, when you bring it up and not, you know, maybe bring it up all the time. And also the other thing too is you can find allies in that meeting. You know, the people in the newsroom that you can go to ahead of time. It's like, you know, we're going to discuss A, B, and C. So can you bring it up this time and be the first person to talk about the diversity issue or talk about this and that? I do that all, you know, I do that all the time. And that way, then you can chime in. Oh yeah, Tim raises a great point. You know, and I'm glad he saw that. And let me just add, you know, and then that way you're spreading it around. And it's just like how you sometimes how you run and control meetings. You know, it's you read a lot about management and things like that. You can do that. You just can plan out how a meeting's gonna go by doing some pre-work ahead of time. That's maybe covering politicians all these years. I just picked up their DVDs, but you can do it.
I think, and probably maybe for me, it's just as you get older, I remember being more timid about raising those issues, but now I kind of embrace it. It's like maybe by speaking up, I'm going to make an impact somehow. I'm going to make my editor think differently, and so I think if you think about the value of what you're doing, it helps you kind of get over the fact, oh, here she goes again, kind of comments, you know. So I think there's some value to that.
Great. So I'd like to open it up now to any questions from any of you. Does anyone have a question they'd like to direct to any of our panelists? Yeah.
No. No, I totally get what you're saying. I think your point about the foreign shields is great because it's ridiculous to me. You can look great on a sideline without foreign shields, without a a low-cut tank top. I mean, the bottom line is you're on an athletic field, so you kind of take that into consideration. You want to be sharing news, and you don't want to be distracting. And I've seen a lot of sideline reporters who are very distracting with the 4-inch heels or the low-cut shirts. And I think you can balance that. You can be dressed feminine if that's what you want, and you can look pretty, and you can do all those things without having to do what you suggested. And I think, I mean, I blame a lot of sort of the management at ESPN or at Fox Sports for not having those conversations with sideline reporters. You know, that you don't have to be this way. You'll still be very successful and accomplished, you know, dressing this way and things like that. I just think that a lot of the problems start at the top because they're not being addressed. But I agree. I mean, you know, the fact that you sort of notice that if someone has those heels just says a lot because it's distracting from the story.
This is actually also raises an interesting point because I always assumed that women felt either an expectation that they would dress in the way that they are dressing, or that they were actually encouraged by management to do it. And so I also sort of wonder if we know how much of it is a choice by a woman who says, yeah, you know, I think I'm going to wear 4-inch heels to the game today, or if it's a manager who said, you know, you really looked kind of sloppy when you were wearing tennis shoes. Like, you should really try to dress up a little bit when you go out there. You're going to be on TV.
Yeah, I think that's a good question because I think it's probably coming a little bit from both directions. But again, I think those conversations have to start from the top, and I'm just amazed to this day that that's still such an issue. But it is. I mean, it seems like every year during college football season, the clothing of somebody is brought up. Like, did you see what she was wearing? And it's all over social media, and I feel a little bit like they don't mind that that's an issue because it's generating, you know, hits on Twitter, and everybody knows Erin Andrews' name, or everybody knows this person's name, and sometimes it's because of what she was wearing. So the money, the rights that is being spent on to get the NFL rights or college football rights, there's so much money involved that I think it's interfering with good decision making. I think they're just happy to get the hits on social media and things like that.
Sort of makes the case for radio, doesn't it?
There you go, exactly.
At least on appearance. But I have, and and I still deal largely in print media or digital. I mean, I do a little bit of video for the Republic, but we have one of our colleagues she's done like a talk at one of our storyteller nights about her dress, and she's a features writer. But years ago, she was held back by an editor from going to an assignment because she showed up for work in a mini skirt and striped knee socks, and I forget what she was wearing on the top, but it was playful, it was youthful, it was certainly a statement of her individuality. It just wasn't appropriate for the interview that she was going to go out on, and her editor said, you know, postpone that interview, do it tomorrow, and come dressed appropriately. Again, you know, my view as a reporter is that I am not the subject of the interview. It's the other person, and you know, I want to interview the person wearing the funky knee socks and you know, et cetera, to work.
It's also interesting. I can also sort of think of situations where maybe someone didn't necessarily wear something that was like inappropriate or too playful, but something that was maybe comfortable and felt a little bit casual. And I can remember being at NPR, and when someone was needed to run to the White House or to the Hill last minute to do a quick recording or something like that, it was like, I don't know for certain, but it seemed like the people who knew that that was a possibility kind of came to work dressed in a way that they knew they could fit in on the Hill and not have a big problem. So I don't know that it ever actually held someone back from an assignment, but it definitely was something that was that came up, and I think comes up in a different way for women than men.
Oh, and here in Arizona, I mean, we're so relaxed, you know. I mean, you know, and I mean, I run around at the state capitol all the time, and you know, there are some of the women lawmakers, they'll wear the suit jacket, you know, and the little bit of the armor, you know. But a lot of people they're dressed rather, you know, casually. And certainly the press corps, we're not going to get on any, you know, GQ or Vogue covers. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yeah. That's an excellent question.
I kind of think I practice this on purpose almost every day um, with my boyfriend by arguing because I really do feel like you get to know it's just sort of like if you think of it from an opposition standpoint, you get to know your opposition more by how much you learn about their thinking and how they think or how they argue with you. So a lot of times I'll just start different conversations with my boyfriend because he's very much in a male-dominated field. He's around men all day long. A lot of times when he's talking about stuff, it comes from that male mentality, and I'm just like, why is he saying this right now? Or what's going on in there? Where did these things come from? And so a lot of times I'll just start talking to him about something just to see what it is he's going to say or why he's thinking that. So a lot of times I feel like I learn the most about dealing with, an opposing point of view, or especially a male point of view, by arguing with them. not not in a detrimental way, but more like a sparring kind of a, I guess, you're really trying to pick their brain and see why are you thinking this way? Because it really does help when I'm talking to someone else I don't know and saying, okay, I have this other, voice in my head then think, that kind of adds to my conversation of at least giving me another point of view of saying, okay, I can kind of get what you're saying because I've heard it before, but that doesn't mean I agree with it. It's just I understand that, okay, there's more than one person thinking this way. Why is that? And so you kind of can get into a different way of thinking about it by trying to put yourself in the other person's point of view, I guess. But that's just my own personal way. It kind of works well for me, especially since most of my interviewees are men.
Well, I mean, I think it gets back to what we were saying earlier. I mean, the collective can help, as an individual to go to, a supervisor, a male supervisor, and raise some of these points about assignments or, whatever else. But when you have a collective of women who can sit down with management and say, we've noticed a pattern over the last, 5 years or 10 years that the people who get the assignments, covering the White House or going overseas for cover conflicts, they tend to be male, or covering the economic beat, or covering the, certain beats on Capitol Hill. And I know that's what happened at the Washington Post, back in, I don't know, the late 70s, early 80s. That's what women did. Um, in um, in broadcast, I don't know how much that happens. If women will go to the station managers or the news producers and say, let's have a conversation about this. I hope it happens, but I don't know. I don't know if it does. And then media is just so it's just all over the place trying to figure out what it is nowadays and how to get ratings and how to get eyeballs and all of that. And I don't know how much that plays into it. When it used to be that Channel 12 or Channel 5 or Channel, 15 or whatever, it captured a certain amount of eyeballs in the city. And now you've got so many different places to go. And, perhaps there's a desperation among management that if we have a pretty, young woman who's dressed a little bit more provocatively than, back in the day, that we can capture some of those eyeballs. So I'm sure it's economics, it's sexism, it's tradition, it's, not knowing what to do these days. I'm sure all of that plays into it, unfortunately.
And I think we have time for one more question if there's any more questions out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. It's, it's a great topic because the person I was talking about, her name is Inez, and I cannot remember her last name. I spoke with her briefly after all that whole wedding dress thing, and she was very knowledgeable about football. And I was thinking, gosh, she could have just asked a normal question. But you're right, entertainment. Talking to her, entertainment is a big priority, and I think the best way to sort of get your point across is to find good stories and what whether the Latino stories or whatever, and present those stories to bosses more than this sort of entertainment. If you can dig and find good stories, I think that can always win over somebody who's making the important decisions in print or radio or television.
And I run the New Media Innovation and Entrepreneurship Lab at the Cronkite School, and one thing I know is that there is an opportunity for young journalists to perhaps, create that, Politico or that, ProPublica for the Latino community, because, up until just recently, the Spanish media companies had such a great run in terms of the entire family sitting down watching the news and watching the novellas and watching everything else. But as the younger people your age and even below, you're starting to see a cleaving off of that. You're starting to see that they're not sitting down with the family to watch the news. So if they're not watching Univision or Telemundo, where are they getting their news? Where are they getting this information? What are the opportunities there to maybe create something that's more millennial centric for people who are not doing what their maybe older brothers and sisters did previously. Mobile first. We know that the Latino community have over indexes when it comes to mobile usage. So are there some opportunities there to do the type of programming that you're talking about in a different format, lower cost, lower barrier to entry, to get people like yourselves, English first, younger people who are interested in the issues, who want to interface around with each other around the 2016 election and so on and so forth. Because I think from talking to people at the two big media companies, that they're kind of starting to panic a little bit too, because they're seeing that groups are now starting to splinter off. The younger people are moving off. And how do we get those back? Well, maybe not having more entertainment shows is the way to do it. I don't know. I mean, BET went through the same thing too, where younger African Americans or people who once you get past like out of college, how do you get that group to come back to BET on a regular basis? They don't have time to watch videos all day. So what is it that you're providing? And one of the things that BET did was created a separate network that hasn't really worked, but they're looking for those answers by trying to be more entrepreneurial in the way that they're looking at the problem. Because one size doesn't fit all when you have such a large community, and then you have these demographic shifts. So here's an opportunity for you to say, let me create something.
And I can just add to what Reetha's saying, just because half of my stories are in Latino business and the Latino community, and that was part of the reason why I jumped into trying to join these two different demographic groups, is because there's not a lot of, like you said, content that's really research driven. It's not really issue driven in those two areas that take into account the larger economic discussion. So there's a lot of things that are starting to happen now, at least from what I've seen and what I've researched. So a lot of it will be research driven in the next couple of years, and convincing those bigger networks that that the trends and demographics are changing, because they did have it pinned at one time, as Rita said, knowing that there was families, that it was these types of people, and they had their family time, and they were all connected in a certain way, and that was good for that time. But now they're going to have to start all over again and start doing new focus groups, starting to see what people are interested in. And certain groups are starting to do that, but it's very small, it's very spotty to see where the new trends are following. And I would say, because there is also a sort of a new generation too of local based type of reporting, and some of the people that have left the bigger networks, because like reporters that got tired of doing the same old kind of the entertainment, or not so content driven, they've left some of those networks after years and years of just kind of dealing with the same thing, to go off and start their own kind of experiments in media and things. There's a great kind of example of it here and locally in Phoenix is a lady who was from Univision and she started her own media company here as well as Mary Rabago. She's kind of a good figure in the community right now, but she's very community based. She does everything focused more on content, family driven, and she left for those reasons because she didn't feel like the content was there from the network. So I think being connected with the community issues is huge, to know where those shifts are going to happen and be able to tap into those stories before the networks have them. That's going to be the biggest opportunity probably.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I was so pleased that I got to be a part of it. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. I will be around a little bit after, and I think our panelists may be around for a few minutes if you want to ask any questions to anyone in particular or chat with us at all. Thank you all so much for coming and making this successful. We really, really appreciate it. And I think that Trisha informed me we also have a raffle drawing to do before we leave. It looks like it might be for an HD radio.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank